Anzalone show. This is the second episode of our Memorial Day doubleheader here. We had a pretty good audience for the Scott Horton show earlier in the day. Now we have Jon Hoffman making his first appearance on the show. He is a research fellow in defense and foreign policy studies at the Cato Institute and an adjunct professor at George Mason University. And his articles appear in The Hill, Time, recent at the American Conservative. That is fantastic. And we almost always link to them on the front page at antiwar.com. In fact, his latest article will be our spotlight article tomorrow. So, Jon, big fan of your work. I think you do fantastic breakdowns, especially in the Trump administration. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. Welcome to the Kyle Anzalone Show.
Thank you for having me on, man. That must be the coolest intro video I've ever seen on any show.
All right. Well, I have a fantastic producer that puts together a lot of this for me. I can assure you I'm not capable of doing that myself. So, on today's show, just a quick rundown. We're going to be talking about Iran talks, Israel firing on diplomats in the West Bank, Netanyahu's statements on the slogan Free Palestine, and then Trump's latest remarks about Vladimir Putin. So, Jon, starting off here, I did write this for antiwar.com in the news section over the weekend that we had the fifth round of talks between the US and Iranian officials. And depending on who you listen to here, it either went well or it didn't. So the Iranian foreign minister said this round was one of the most professional stages of negotiations we have ever experienced. In this meeting, the positions and principles of the Islamic Republic of Iran regarding the negotiation processes were once again presented with complete transparency. And that sounded very good. But then the Omani officials who actually negotiated didn't sound so pleased. They said that the talks were conducted with some, but not conclusive progress. And so I thought this kind of factored in very interestingly with your recent article from the American Conservative. The Trump Netanyahu rift hinges on Gaza and Iran. And so let's just start with, what are your takes on Trump's progress when it comes to making a deal with Iran? It seems the big thing here is around nuclear enrichment. Publicly, they can't have it, but Iran is saying that's a red line, and privately, they seem fairly happy with the American position right now.
Yeah, I think first on the matter of enrichment, this has been a stated red line for Tehran for decades. So this isn't that just came out of the blue, out of nowhere. This is something everybody knows is a red line for Tehran. Currently, Iran is enriching up to 60% of uranium. You need 90% for a nuclear weapon. The JCPOA capped Iranian enrichment at 3.67%, but Trump withdrew from the deal. So the real sticking matter here is the enrichment. I've seen different proposals floated from they're going to have to import enriched uranium to they can keep up to 3.67 like was under the JCPOA. And then of course there's the calls for zero enrichment, which again is a non-starter for Tehran. But I think the talks this past weekend, if you listen to Trump in particular, he said that they're progressing, they're moving forward, and I don't think there was any conclusive deal sealed this past weekend. But the fact that they're continuing talks, the fact that Trump is giving this optimistic tone, I would say, is promising.
Does seem at times that we get the right messaging from the Iranians, which is interesting given the public statements from Iran. And so what do you think is the disparity between what we're hearing publicly and what's going on behind the scenes?
Look, there's a lot of different constituencies within Trump's base, and the neocon, very hawkish faction wants to see zero enrichment, and they want to see zero enrichment because they're introducing this idea of zero enrichment because they know it will be a non-starter for Tehran. There's really, and I've sung this tune till I was blue in the face. There's really two debates going on here in Washington D.C. One is the matter of nuclear nonproliferation and the best way to achieve that. It's clear the best way to achieve that is negotiations, a diplomatic deal. The other debate is the regime change debate. And the problem is that these two debates mix together and are so intertwined because for the regime change folks, those who view Tehran as the chief problem in the Middle East, anything short of regime change, whether it be a nuclear deal or lifting of sanctions and so on, is a form of appeasement. So, what I call for in the American Conservative article is for Trump to sideline these voices. He already has in certain ways. But as we get closer to a deal, you can expect these voices to get louder.
I was thinking when we get these public statements that Iran can't enrich uranium, is the Trump administration is attempting to maybe sideline the Republican hawks, who, if they knew that Trump was actually telling the Iranians that they would be able to enrich uranium and agree to a deal, would be passing legislation right now that says that the president can't remove sanctions on Iran if they continue to enrich uranium, which would certainly prevent any kind of deal from actually taking place. And so it's interesting. May he's even battling here some forces within his own party. Um, next up here. No, so anyways, I'm just wondering your thoughts on that, and if you think it's possible to get a deal done.
I certainly think it's possible if Trump goes in with realistic expectations. I think even Trump could probably get a deal that's better than the JCPOA, though it should be said the JCPOA worked. I've seen different proposals floated that maybe instead of a 15-year sunset clause, we'll have a 25-year sunset clause. And then there's this debate of to what extent does the deal actually have to be different and better from the JCPOA for Trump to market it as a win? Because remember, he said the JCPOA was the worst deal ever made, et cetera, et cetera. But there is a real opportunity here to push for a deal with Tehran, but it requires, again, to avoid this poison pill of no enrichment. And then I've also seen ideas floated about, we're going to bring in discussions of ballistic missiles also to these nuclear negotiations, which again, I have a very hard time believing that Tehran would be willing to negotiate on that, given the fact that its partners across the region, Hezbollah and others, are rather degraded. They're on the back foot right now. So if you're talking about just deterrence, their two strongest pillars right now are their ballistic missiles and the prospect of a nuclear breakout. So you're talking about matters that are very close to the heart of the Iranian regime. I it's almost impossible to tell which direction the administration is moving in any particular day, but I hope we're moving in the direction of a deal.
On the Iran talks. No, all right. So actually, let's move on here.
We're in an intense seven-front war that was launched against us by Iran and its proxies. Sometimes in war, accidents happen. One such incident happened the other day in Jenin, and thankfully no one was hurt. Our military has expressed its regret over the event because we don't target civilians or diplomats. We target terrorists. For those who say that Israel stands alone, I say we're not alone. Justice stands with us. The truth stands with us. History stands with us. And so do countless people around the world who can tell the difference between right and wrong, between good and evil. I want to thank all of them. And I especially want to thank President Trump and the American people for their forthright stand with Israel and with the Jewish people. Together we stand, together we'll triumph, and we'll see the victory of civilization over barbarism.
So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on Netanyahu's statement.
First, the civilization over barbarism stuff is a line he has used since the '90s, and he is really beating that horse to death. But second, on the firing close to the diplomatic observers in the West Bank, look, it's almost impossible to know whether this was an accident, whether this was intentional, or so on. But I think it speaks to a broader issue here. The just widespread, indiscriminate way in which the Israeli army has gone about the past 19 months, and that goes to show. He said in his speech there, he said Israel only targets terrorists. Well, you're seeing record levels of journalists killed, record levels of UN members killed, and so on. So either these individuals are being targeted directly, or you're bombing and shooting so indiscriminately that they're dying as collateral damage. So it's tough at this age to take anything Netanyahu says seriously, which is why, as I mentioned in the American Conservative article, from a perspective of U.S. policy, there is no strategic benefit for the United States continuing to bankroll this war. This has been detrimental for our interests. This has been detrimental for regional stability. Trump has a real opportunity to bring this to an end and seal a deal with Tehran and bring some sort of semblance of stability back to the Middle East.
What do you think the prospects are for Trump actually breaking with Netanyahu in a way? And I think you explained this in your article very well. It has to have a policy change, right? Like if Trump just doesn't like Netanyahu, but in every other way just continues to back what Israel is doing, does this really change? It doesn't really change anything. It doesn't really matter. So where do you think this goes? Where maybe we get some actual substantive change or no?
No, I think you're exactly right. And we saw this first under Biden. Almost every month we saw a report about how Biden was so frustrated, just so very angry with Netanyahu for not playing ball. But we never saw it reflected in policy, despite the fact that Washington has all the leverage here. So in the article, what I was trying to raise is Trump is striking the right rhetoric again, this idea of no endless wars and so on and so forth. And there are all these reports about him being frustrated with Netanyahu, but this needs to be reflected in policy. Where it differs from the Biden administration is we actually have seen certain changes in policy so far. We've seen in Syria, he's lifting the sanctions, though it's hit some road bumps, but he's lifting the sanctions and he's withdrawing some U.S. troops, both of which Israel objected to. In Yemen, he ended the campaign against the Houthis, which was just the epitome of strategic malpractice. And so he, ended that. And notably, in that deal, there was no agreement for whereby the Houthis have to stop targeting Israel or Israeli ships. He sealed the deal with Hamas to get the release of the last Israeli American hostage, the last living Israeli American hostage, and he's continuing to negotiate with Iran, and all of this has been objected to by Israel. So we have seen policy change, but where we really need to see it is sealing a deal with Tehran and ending U.S. support for the war in Gaza.
As much as you can say there has been policy change, and those are all examples that are hard to argue with, especially ending the war in Yemen against the Houthis. I mean, without them agreeing not to attack Israel, it seems to be the initial way that the Houthis said that the U.S. could have avoided this conflict in the first place. And I guess the only good thing is the U.S. media knows so little about Yemen that they're not making a big deal out of Trump essentially losing a war to a group that people think is like the name of an American band, right? The Houthis. So this is just kind of crazy how this works out. But at the same time, Trump has sent Netanyahu plane loads of U.S. bombs. His Department of Homeland Secretary, Kristi Noem, was just, doing a photo op at the Western Wall in all of her garb and everything like that. So there are statements from the administration saying there really is no split. And look, Netanyahu is moving forward with what he is calling a fairly explicit genocide. He's saying that 50% of the Palestinians are going to leave. We're getting reports from NBC News that the Trump administration is approaching Libya about taking them in. So, if you support the genocide, there's not a real rift there, I don't think.
So what I think we're starting to see is a rift, not between the United States and Israel, definitely not,
Okay.
but perhaps the inklings of a rift between Trump and Netanyahu. And we've seen in the past rifts between US presidents and specific Israeli leaders. I'm thinking back to, George Bush Sr. over settlements, or Reagan over Lebanon. So there were, moments where there was actual contention here. It never challenged the underlying structural foundations of the quote unquote special relationship, but they were examples of when there were tensions between the American president and the Israeli premier. What I hope is happening is that this public rhetoric about, oh no, there's no rift, there's no rift. I'm hoping that Trump is using the leverage that Washington has by bankrolling this war with weapons, money, diplomatic cover, and so on, to pressure Netanyahu towards actually sealing a deal with Hamas. And like you mentioned, what Israel is currently doing right now in Gaza is really indefensible. The images and the videos that are coming out are apocalyptic. Just the other day, Israel said, I think it was on Sunday, just yesterday, their goal is to now control 75% of Gaza, pushing everybody all Palestinians in Gaza into 25% of the territory, to then ultimately be sent or exiled from their homes, essentially ethnically cleanse the strip. And Netanyahu has said this is now a condition for ending the war, the so-called Trump plan, which is tantamount to ethnic cleansing. So, the direction in which this is heading is absolutely abysmal. But Trump does have the ability to actually change course if he wants to.
uh, Always the hope with Donald Trump is where the Biden administration was so dedicated to the establishment position, right? Like you were expected to like walk the path, even if that path leads right to the brink of nuclear war with Russia, they were going to walk that path, right? And then with Donald Trump, one day you have him threatening and warning Russia, and the next day, saying talks are possible. The same with the Iranians. Now, John, I have long warned that eventually the U.S. support for Israel would wind up with violence in the streets of America. I've been very concerned about this. And initially, you think Muslim terror originating from the Middle East, something like 9/11. However, we did have an event last week where two people who worked at the Israeli consulate in D.C. were shot and killed on the streets of Washington, D.C. An absolutely horrific act. But this is being used by Benjamin Netanyahu to try to shift or contain the political narrative in the US. So let's hear this clip from Netanyahu.
Free Palestine. This is exactly the same chant we heard on October 7th. On that day, thousands of terrorists stormed into Israel from Gaza. They beheaded. We're in an intense seven-front war that was launched against us by Iran and its proxies. Sometimes in war, accidents happen. One such incident happened the other day in Jenin, and thankfully no one was hurt. Our military has expressed its regret over the event because we don't target civilians or diplomats. We target terrorists. For those who say that Israel stands alone, I say we're not alone. Justice stands with us. The truth stands with us. History stands with us. And so do countless people around the world who can tell the difference between right and wrong, between good and evil. I want to thank all of them. And I especially want to thank President Trump and the American people for their forthright stand with Israel and with the Jewish people. Together we stand, together we'll triumph, and we'll see the victory of civilization over barbarism.
So, of course, that was the clip from Janine. But Netanyahu, in his statement, basically just said that free Palestine is what was chanted when Hamas invaded Israel on October 7th. And so when people say free Palestine in the United States now, it's equivalent to supporting terrorism.
Yeah. So first, on the shooting that took place in D.C., like you said, completely horrific, indefensible. Not only is the killing of innocent civilians atrocious, but this will do absolutely nothing to advance the Palestinian cause, or the ostensibly what he wanted to see, which was an end to the war, whatever. This will not get you there at all. Uh, on the phrase "Free Palestine" being equated to support for terrorism. No, this is just blatantly false. Uh, there's always been an effort to equate certain phrases and certain words, with criticism writ large of the Israeli people or so on. But what we're criticizing here is the policies of the Israeli government. We're criticizing the policies of a sovereign nation state. And insofar as the United States is concerned, by facilitating this war with weapons, money, diplomatic cover, and so on, the the United States has the leverage here. The United States has a say. The United States is an active party to this conflict, unfortunately. So this is where, as you just mentioned regarding President Trump, this is where I think Trump's uniqueness, love it or hate it, uh, could be beneficial, because you don't know what this man is going to do. He's very erratic. He's very unpredictable. I don't agree with a tremendous amount of his policies, but if it could actually lead to ending the war in Gaza, and bringing us back from the brink of war with Tehran, I would support that, of course.
Right. And I do believe we have that statement from Netanyahu now on his remarks on Free Palestine, if we want to play it.
Free Palestine. This is exactly the same chant we heard on October 7th. On that day, thousands of terrorists stormed into Israel from Gaza. They beheaded men, they raped women, they burned babies alive. Free Palestine is just today's version of Heil Hitler. They don't want a Palestinian state. They want to destroy the Jewish state. I could never understand how this simple truth evades the leaders of France, Britain, Canada, and others. They're now proposing to establish a Palestinian state and reward these murderers with the ultimate prize. You won't be surprised to learn that Hamas thanked President Macron and Prime Ministers Starmer and Carney for demanding that Israel end its war in Gaza immediately. Now, these leaders may think that they're advancing peace. They're not. So don't give us this talk. It'll be a peaceful Palestinian state. It won't be.
So, John, if you have any more comments on his remarks there.
No, I think it just shows that he's scrambling. I think, the world sees what's going on. You're seeing now even former Israeli officials, former prime ministers speaking out saying, what the hell are we doing now in Gaza? There was a really good piece in Financial Times, I think it was by Ehud Barak, saying this is indefensible. There's no strategic goal here whatsoever. So you're starting to see slowly, and something that should have come a lot earlier, but you're starting to see a turn whereby international discourse surrounding the war is changing. And I think Netanyahu realizes that. And because the continuation of the war is so intimately connected to his political survival, I think this is him scrambling.
Yeah, I do agree with you on that. And I had Kelly Vallejos on the show recently who said, it's not just the American people, or as you say, the international community, but particularly younger Republicans who are the most effective users of social media. And I think kind of have an oversized influence on the political conversation in the United States at this point, particularly when it comes to the MAGA community and Donald Trump himself. And so I do think there is some desperation from Netanyahu. I'm not sure that this is the messaging that's going to apply to them. I think, he would maybe be wiser to try to link this to the campus, protests like during COVID, the Black Lives Matter stuff versus saying the Hail Hitler thing, because that almost sounds more like a left wing tactic. But, I do think it's so interesting that Netanyahu does seem so desperate at this point. Now, before we wrap up, I want to get your statements and hear your thoughts on Trump's latest remarks on Vladimir Putin and the U.S. Russia negotiations.
Yeah, I'll give you an update. I'm not happy with what Putin's doing. He's killing a lot of people, and I don't know what the hell happened to Putin. I've known him a long time, always gotten along with him, but he's sending rockets into cities and killing people, and I don't like it at all, okay? We're in the middle of talking, and he's shooting rockets into Kiev and other cities. I don't like it at all.
President, what do you want to do about that?
I'm surprised. I'm very surprised. We'll see what we're going to do. What am I going to tell you? You're the fake news, aren't you? You're totally fake. All right, any other questions? I don't like what Putin is doing, not even a little bit. He's killing people. And something happened to this guy, and I don't like it.
Can I follow up on that? A Russian commander reportedly said that Putin was almost caught in the middle of a drone attack from Ukraine. So do you have any...
I haven't heard that, but maybe that would be a reason. I don't know, but I have not heard that.
So this exchange to me is just absolutely insane, and for a number of reasons. One, it's Donald Trump, so it's so much more entertaining than if it was Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, giving any kind of remarks on the thing. And so you're really drawn in by it. And then he goes on this rant of Putin's changed, she's attacking cities, what could possibly be going on? You're the fake news media. And then the reporters who are typically, I think Trump's right, fake news, especially escalating the threat that Trump poses to Ukraine. And she says, it seems like there was an assassination attempt on Putin's life pretty recently. And Trump, I think, he's an actor. It's important to remember. So maybe this is all a show, but he seems genuinely surprised that that happened. And I think is thinking and processing, oh, that could be the cause of what's going on here. And so my first question to you is, how can the president not know that there was an assassination attempt on the life of Vladimir Putin in recent days? I mean, this could provoke a nuclear war. This is absolute insanity.
So first, that clip I saw it the other day. It's hilarious. What am I going to tell you? You're the fake media. But on overall, so in terms of whether Trump knew about the assassination or not, I can't speak to that. But when it comes to negotiations over ending the war in Ukraine, and particularly ending U.S. involvement in the war in Ukraine, there's a lot of different ways you can approach this idea of American restraint, of American realism. You can get to it from the left, you can get to it from the right, or you can get to it kind of from the nerdy middle, IR academic people. And that's where I approach it. When it comes to Ukraine and when it comes to Europe, I would say America's chief interest in Europe for more than a century has been anti-hegemonic in nature. It's been preventing the emergence of a European hegemon. And the United States and Europeans have been pretty successful here. Kaiser Wilhelm, Adolf Hitler, the Soviet Union. There's a lot of wins here. When it comes to Vladimir Putin, he is not on the level of any of those. So this idea of continuing to bankroll the war in Ukraine because it's the frontier of civilization, or whatever rhetoric is used to justify it, this is just nonsense. And what I would say is, Trump said when he took office, he will measure his success not by the wars that he gets into, or wars that he fights, or we'll measure our success even by the wars that we don't get into, whatever. This is a great opportunity in Ukraine to find some sort of negotiated settlement, because there is no end in sight to this conflict. Same with Gaza, same with U.S. tensions with Iran. Trump has a real opportunity here to not tie all these things together directly, but to rack up a solid amount of foreign policy wins if he has the will to do it.
Only concern on the war in Ukraine is that, and this has been predicted from some time, so I don't want to sound like an alarmist, but how much time does the Ukrainians have, and how much leverage do the Ukrainians have? We have this clip from Marco Rubio during his Senate testimony recently explaining. All right. So in this statement, we don't have the clip, but in this statement, Marco Rubio tells Jean Shaheen that, look, Ukraine's asking for more air defenses. They need more air defenses. And yet, we don't have any to give. The Europeans don't have that many to give, and the ones they have, they want to keep. And so, if Ukraine does run out of air defenses and effectively can't defend their cities from Russian attacks, I mean, this thing could be over relatively quickly. And so I think that adds even more importance on Donald Trump. I mean, the U.S. led the Ukrainians down this primrose path, getting them into this war in Ukraine, where they have largely suffered for the Western goal of weakening Russia. So now that I think it's our last chance to save the Ukrainian state, maybe. And I worry that Trump doesn't is rightfully frustrated with the Ukrainians for not wanting to go down this path. And so he's just going to decide, you know what, I'm done with it. And that's bad for the Ukrainians.
No, this is a war of attrition, one that Russia is far better suited for than Ukraine. Larger economy, more people, more weapons. So the Ukrainians really do have a losing hand here. And I want to go to the point that you made about the weapons, because I think this is critical, because we're seeing it not just in Ukraine, but also before the campaign in Yemen was ended. We're seeing it with the ongoing war in Gaza. The United States is really draining its munitions here, that many have, rightfully noted, would be consequential if China decided to make a move on Taiwan, and so on. So the United States is rapidly draining its own stockpiles of weapons in conflicts that are these protracted quagmires that have absolutely no end in sight. So no, I appreciate you bringing that up, because that's something that we at Cato often hammer home and say, look, our resources are finite. These are not infinite. We cannot continue to engage in these endless wars. And I would say, if anybody's interested, go listen to Vice President Vance's recent speech. He talked about it pretty clearly. He said we can't continue to have these open-ended conflicts, these forever wars, and we need to root our foreign policy in some semblance of realism. And I think moving towards ending U.S. support for what's happening in or ending U.S. Involvement in the war in Ukraine, ending U.S. involvement in the war in Gaza. Those are steps in that direction.
So, John, just let's wrap it up here. And I want to ask you a final question. You know, the negotiating team, we have kind of Wickoff on one end, who I think is a man who is willing to kind of be Trumpian, think outside of the box. And then on the other end, we have Marco Rubio, who, as much as he seems to not be the Secretary of State as far as Wickoff is leading all of the negotiations, whether it comes to Iran, with Israel, Hamas, even, and Ukraine. Rubio is now the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. And look, in the Trump administration, that could mean nothing. In the previous administration, if Blinken was the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State, I think he would have effectively been the President of the United States of America, certainly the Commander in Chief, right? But in the Trump administration, I guess it could mean nothing, but it also could be extremely significant if Rubio has a lot of sway. Certainly, Rubio could be somebody who doesn't want Trump to know about assassination attempts on President Putin's life, because that you would think would make Trump not want to give Ukrainians more weapons that they're going to use them to try to kill Putin or something like that.
Yeah, I think there's this old adage, personnel is policy. You can often tell the policies that a president's going to pursue by the people he surrounds himself with in these appointed positions. I don't know if that's the case with Trump, because, like you said, Marco Rubio is kind of the TV Secretary of State, while Steve Witkoff is essentially doing everything. So I don't know to the extent that actors like Marco Rubio and others really have agency, because it does seem that it is policymaking is such a tight circle right now. Trump and the immediate people surrounding him. That's why when I try to judge, U.S. Middle East policy or just U.S. foreign policy in general, I often try and look at what Trump and Vance are saying, because decision making is so concentrated within the White House. Marco Rubio, of course, has historically been a very hawkish individual. He's hawkish on Iran. He's hawkish on Russia. He's hawkish on China. The man is a hawk. But what I think we're seeing in terms of messaging from Donald Trump and messaging from JD Vance is a lot more, I wouldn't call it restraint per se, but a lot more skepticism when it comes to a lot of these either entangling alliances, or whether it comes to U.S. Military interventionism abroad. And it's only been 4 months of the Trump administration. He has 4 years. So I really hope, and I talk about this often. This piece was kind of saying the same thing in American Conservative. The rhetoric is moving in the right direction. We just now need to see this actually followed through on in policy.
Hey, I hope you will return to the Kyle Anzalone show in the future, and maybe we'll have some positive things to say. If not, we'll be breaking down all the bad news. Everybody, be sure to check out John's work. He's at the Cato Institute, adjunct professor at George Mason University. His articles often appear in the American Conservative and other outlets, and always posted on the front page at antiwar.com. So, John, thanks for returning to the show, and hopefully we could do it again soon.
Thank you, Kyle.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into the Kyle Anzalone show today. We had a couple great guests, a doubleheader for Memorial Day, and we will be back with our next show on Wednesday at 4:45 Eastern Time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the show. Help us get out there to a larger audience.